Hi everybody, welcome to Thursday's Indycar. I'm Gordon Ross. Today I wanted to explain a little bit more about what the growth report was all about and why the SNP published this piece of independent analysis. A lot of people have complained about the Growth Commission's report on how independence could happen because it does a number of things which we weren't expecting to see in a report published by the SNP, namely things like paying down our share of the deficit, for example, something which a lot of people took issue with, and also this business of the slow movement from UK pounds to a new Scottish currency. Now, why on earth is this report published, and what's the purpose of it? Well, the purpose of it is actually to show the Tories primarily and the UK British nationalists, or as we used to call them, unionists among us, that independence could be achieved by the Tory party even, using their own ideologies, using their own market forces, using their own debt repayments, even though we'd be using the same gloomy, pessimistic assumptions that we are told by the British state we would have to assume in order to be independent. So this is the worst case scenario that's being presented to you as a report. It shows you that independence can be achieved at a cost, assuming everything that the British state is true, including things like having to pay down a share of the deficit and having to start with austerity to begin with in order to pay down this deficit, and then to carry on continuing to pay a share of the deficit for years afterwards. You know, £5 billion a year to the British state for a deficit which really wasn't our fault. So all of these things are included in the report. It's a hypothetical report, and what it shows, and it shows to the British media and it shows to the British state, that no matter what they say and all of the arguments that they've deployed against independence, if we deploy them, if all the arguments that the UK has used against independence are included in a report, this is what independence would look like. This is how it could be done, assuming that we apply the rules that the British state has forced upon us. So in other words, this is British Scotland being independent. This is the British version of it. This is what would happen if we believed any of the stuff that the British state tells us about our economy. And yet still, the Growth Commission report proves that independence is not only possible, but it's deliverable very quickly, certainly within 10 years, and that currency is not an issue, and that currency can be smoothed out, and we can use the pound, and we can move from the British pound to the Scottish pound over a period of up to 10 years. 10 years is the pessimistic view, and that's the worst case scenario. So don't think that when you are reading the headlines behind this Growth Commission report, that this is in some way a retreat by the SNP to a more conservative neoliberal viewpoint, a much more conservative ideology of how independence would be done. This isn't the way it would be done. This is the way that the Tories would do it if they were for independence. And it's to prove to everybody in Scotland that independence is possible, even given the most gloomy, pessimistic, backward, Tory ideologically driven Brexit, including Scotland being independent. All of these things. So this exit from the UK would occur as well as the exit from the EU. This is the worst case scenario, and it's still feasible. Even without oil revenues, it still works. And this is the point of the Growth Commission report. It proves it. It proves it in economical language that the Tories understand, that business people understand, that politicians of the right understand. And that is why the media could not attack it, because it uses the media's own arguments to make the case for independence. It uses the British government's own arguments against independence to prove that independence can be achieved even using Tory methods and Tory ideology and Tory assumptions. So it's a powerful tool in disarming the British media, and that's why they're not saying anything about it, because they cannot argue with the facts, because that's their facts that they would be arguing against, if you see what I mean. So the Growth Commission report is an exercise in proving that British arguments for the economics of Scottish independence are just plain wrong. They don't add up. And when you do the actual mathematics and you ask business people and economists and fairly right-wing thinkers to determine whether Scotland could be independent if we applied all of the information the British state has supplied, then the answer is still yes. Even though it would involve austerity for a number of years, it would involve cuts, but it's still possible. So let's leave that subject for a while now and return to the topic that a lot of people keep asking me about. What happens if the British government does not give us a Section 30 order for a referendum? What are the other options? Well, the other options are pretty straightforward. The first option is to have an information vote. In other words, a vote which informs government on the general public opinion about independence, about separating from the UK, about secession. That's not even the right word, but about separating from the UK. And by having one of these, it's still a referendum, a plebiscite, but this time the result's not legally binding, because that's all a Section 30 order is. We don't need to ask permission of anybody for Scotland to have a vote about whether it wants to continue inside a voluntary union. That's like saying England and Wales aren't allowed to vote to leave the EU. It's plainly rubbish. Of course they are. They're in a political union. Scotland is a country too. We're in a political union, and we are perfectly entitled, if we want to have a vote amongst ourselves to decide whether we stay in that union, because we're not. Britain is not a country. Britain is an amalgamation of 4 countries, and Scotland is the largest of the 3 smaller countries involved. And Scotland has always been a separate state, and it agreed to be part of the union on the basis that it remained separate and the people remained sovereign, and that is still the case to this day. And so we have this referendum, which is not binding under a Section 30 order. So what would happen if we voted yes? Say there was a 70% yes vote in an information-only referendum, an advisory referendum. Well, what could happen? Well, in the first case, the British government and the British parties could boycott the vote. They could say it's not legitimate, we're not going to let any of our supporters vote in it, and thereby we're going to make it an illegitimate vote because we're not going to take part in it. Well, that could happen, and that happened in Catalonia. But if this vote is done in such a way that if you do not vote, it assumes consent, which you can write into the rules of a referendum, that those who do not vote are basically consenting to abide by the result, then there is no point in the British parties not taking part in it. I mean, if they want to fight this independence referendum, then the last thing they want to do is boycott it. They want to have their supporters out voting against it, surely. But they could boycott it and then claim that it was an illegitimate vote, and thereby they weren't going to abide by the result of it. They could do that. So how does that leave the situation if the British state, after a massive yes vote in a big referendum, decides that they're not going to abide by it? Well, the first thing is that the numbers of people who vote yes in that referendum would need to be at least 50% of the voting age population. Now, if you think about this, even if there is a boycott of a national ballot like that, so long as the winning team, in other words, the Yes campaign in this case, turned out, let's say, 2 million or 2.2 million voters for yes, that's an overwhelming majority. Even if all the no voters boycotted it, you can prove that over 50% of the voting population voted for it, and therefore that nullifies their entire argument about it being illegitimate. So the numbers and the arithmetic prove that you've won the vote fairly, and there is no way that they can gainsay that or argue their way around it, because a majority of legally voting age individuals voted yes. There still might be problems with it, though. They could still say, oh, we're not going to abide by it, we're not going to let Scotland separate. And that would provoke a crisis, an international crisis at the UN, within the European Union as well, because we are still members of it. And that is something that the United Nations could resolve, but it would be difficult. The other option is what's sometimes referred to as the nuclear option, which is for the Scottish independence parties, the independence supporting parties in Holyrood, to basically all resign at once, force the general election in Scotland on a single issue. And the single issue would be independence or status quo, leave the UK or remain. And if we won that general election on that single mandate, in other words, you win a majority of seats in the Scottish Parliament, that's another vote for independence. It's not a mandate anymore, it is a yes vote, it's a democratic vote. And in that situation, the British parties would have to abide by it because it's an election result. But that's the nuclear option. That would be the last resort in this case. So there are three different scenarios here, possibilities. But in each possibility, we can circumvent any argument that the British state makes and come back to a democratic majority. What's important, though, is that we win it, because although there are these options, we still have to win a whopping big majority, and we have to make sure that 50% or more of the Scottish electorate turns out and votes yes, to make sure that it is an unequivocal win, and that there is no way that the UN or any other international body of law can say that there wasn't enough people voted for it, or that in some way, because the no voters boycotted it, it's not legal. It's still legal. Remember, we're not Catalonia. We are a country. We're in a voluntary union, one which we supposedly volunteered to enter into with England 300 and something years ago, 311 years ago. And because of that, by a simple majority vote of the Scottish electorate, we can vote to dissolve that union and leave it if we so wish. And I believe that there is now a majority in Scotland who want to do that, because the other option is just not is just unthinkable. The idea of being torn out of the European single market and having our export economy wrecked for the ideology of a foreign party in another country, in another part of this union, would be crazy. Why would any country allow another country to wreck its economy? It makes no sense whatsoever. So just trying to reassure you this morning, those of you who find it difficult to understand how we can have a referendum that will give us the result that we want and force the UK to negotiate the terms of our leaving of the United Kingdom. It can be done. Not only can it be done, it can be done in several different ways. There are lots of different options. Section 30 is not the end of the story. Section 30 is just a hurdle that's been placed in the way. It's the Tories trying to slow us down. But the point is, it doesn't matter whether we get a Section 30 order or not. It just matters how many of us vote yes. It's sheer numbers that count here. We have to respond to the call for a yes vote in bigger numbers than ever. We managed just over 1.6 million yes voters in 2014, against all the odds, working up from 26% of the vote all the way up to 51% just before the vow happened. So we know that we can easily produce a gigantic swing. We've already done it once before, right? We doubled our vote in 2 years. So this time we're operating from a position of at least 50% voting yes already. Before we've begun, we've already had 90,000 odd people out on the streets of Glasgow before. We've had 25,000 out in the streets of Glasgow the year before that, and that was during a general election. So the mood is there. We have to capture that mood and that energy now and build the momentum up even more. And that means we now need to reach out to 16 and 17-year-olds who are going to be critical to us getting over this finish line, getting past this finishing post. I think we need to aim for at least 70% of the vote in order to make this unequivocal, complete landslide victory. No matter whether they give us a Section 30 order or not, we can prove that a majority of the entire electorate of Scotland has voted yes, regardless of whether the unionist parties or the British nationalists among us. It doesn't matter how many of them boycott this. By boycotting it, they're just losing it anyway. If they don't vote against us leaving, then they can't have any say in the result. And if a majority of the population votes yes, then we win. And there's nothing they can do about it, because they cannot say that, you know, less than 50% of the Scottish voting population voted for it. It wouldn't be possible for them to start moving the goalposts like they did in 1979, where they said there has to be a certain number, a certain turnout, before they would respect the result. So we have to assure that we have maximum turnout and that we have a maximum vote of at least 70%, I think, to make sure that this is safe. I believe we're already on the way to that, and I think, without even looking at the polls, because any poll that you do online, even in a newspaper, a British newspaper about independence, is coming back with somewhere in the region of 70 to 80% yes, and that's in public polling, not polling run by me, not polling run by the SNP. This is public polling done by newspapers online. People respond by the thousands and say 70 or 80% of them say yes to independence. It's very embarrassing for the British newspapers to run these polls, because they know that support for independence is so high amongst the readership. Anyway, that's it for today. Again, remember, be positive here. We are winning. We're on the winning side this time. We're not the underdogs this time. We're not the ones with the dodgy plan this time. We're not the ones who don't have the information on how to be independent this time, because we've already proved that you can do it. Even with Tory politics, even with Tory economics, you can still win independence, right? So we know it can be done. The worst case scenario it's now been blown out of the water. That myth has been exploded forever. So independence is not only possible, but almost inevitable now, because people just do not want to go with Brexit. They don't want to risk it. They don't want their jobs going. They don't want their shipyard jobs going down the tubes. They don't want to lose their export orders. They don't want the whisky industry damaged. They don't want the food industry damaged. Shellfish industry would be destroyed by Brexit, because of the delays in shipping fresh produce to Europe would be so long that fresh produce would die and go off in the truck. We can't have it. We can't have Brexit in Scotland. It will cripple us. Okay, enough about Brexit, but remember, independence is going to happen, but it's only going to happen if we turn out in massive numbers, bigger numbers than we've ever done before. We need at least another 600,000, maybe 700,000 people to vote yes, in order to get over the finish line and to annihilate the no vote completely. So think about that, and just remember that everything now is stacked up. All the pieces are in place now for independence to happen. Our task is to convince more and more people now. And in the run-up to whenever this vote is announced, it could be it's announced next autumn, I don't know, but whenever it's announced, we're the ones who are going to make it happen. And remember that there are all these options for different ways of achieving this vote. It doesn't need to be by Section 30 referendum. Bye for now.